Our little nursing school dropout. That was what Dr. Marcus Pierce had called her in the hallway 3 months ago, loud enough for the entire ICU to hear. They didn't know she'd spent 12 years in active duty. They didn't know the surgical scars hidden beneath her scrubs told stories that would make most surgeons weep. The tattoo on the inside of her right wrist, coordinates, latitude and longitude in fading blue ink, marked the place where she'd carried 6 wounded sailors through active fire in Sanjin Valley and lived to tell nobody about it. But Dr. Pierce wouldn't see that. Dr. Pierce saw only what he wanted to see, a credential gap, a threat to his hierarchy, a woman with calloused hands and steady eyes who made his Harvard pedigree feel like expensive wallpaper covering something hollow. Brooke Sullivan moved through the ICU at 0600, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly white that made the machine's lead readouts glow like dying embers. The antiseptic smell hit her first, that sharp chemical burn that never quite left your clothes or your hair, the smell of places where bodies came to be reassembled or released. She'd learned to breathe it without grimacing. 12 years of military medicine had taught her to breathe through worse. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm as she passed each bay, her eyes scanning monitors with the speed of habit, the way her hands moved through vital checks like someone playing a song she'd learned so long ago the music had become muscle memory. She didn't need to think. Her body knew how to calculate doses, interpret numbers, predict what would happen 3 breaths before the monitor confirmed it. Bed 12 had the light on. Captain James Riker was awake, his dark eyes tracking her movement as she entered the bay, and she felt something shift in her chest, the same way it had shifted every morning for 3 months when she saw his face. The decorated officer lay propped at a 35-degree angle, his left arm resting on the cotton blanket, and there it was, Sullivan. Her name tattooed in black letters on his forearm, the letters strong and certain, the kind of ink that meant something. She'd seen it exactly once before, in a minefield at 0430 hours with rounds coming in from 3 directions and Riker's arm hooked under her shoulders as she dragged him across 50 meters of open ground. He'd been screaming her name then. She'd been moving on pure adrenaline and training, her body a machine designed for exactly this kind of moment, and his voice had anchored her, Sullivan. 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 Now he stared at the tattoo the way someone might stare at a word in a foreign language, familiar shape, no meaning. The traumatic brain injury had taken that from him. The blast had scattered pieces of his memory like shrapnel, and the neurologists had explained it to her in clinical terms: anterograde amnesia, hippocampal involvement, cognitive recovery timeline uncertain. Translation: he might never remember why her name was written on his arm. He might never remember the woman who'd risked everything to get him out. "Morning, Captain," she said softly, her voice dropping into the tone she reserved for patients, calm, authoritative without authority, the voice of someone who had learned to command rooms by never demanding anything. She checked the 4 line running into his right hand, her fingers steady as they brushed the cold steel of the bed rail. The bag of normal saline hung at exactly the right height, the drip rate exactly 40 milliliters per hour, the tape holding the needle in place still flush against his skin. She'd placed this line herself 48 hours ago, her hands moving with the precision she'd developed in trauma tents and field hospitals across 3 continents, where precision meant the difference between a patient going home and a patient going into the ground. Riker's eyes tracked her movement, the confusion never leaving his face. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd extubated on day 7. The question landed like it always did, not accusatory, just genuinely lost, a man trying to navigate a world where his own history had been erased. "You're doing well," she said instead of answering, which was the only honest thing she could say without breaking the careful distance she maintained. She adjusted his oxygen flow, checked the pulse ox reading, 94%, stable, the number holding like a heartbeat. Getting stronger every day. Through the glass partition of the ICU bay, Dr. Marcus Pierce stood reviewing a chart, his movements precise and controlled, the movements of someone who had trained his entire life to give the impression of absolute competence. Harvard Medical School, top 10%, fellowship in critical care at Johns Hopkins, board certification in emergency medicine, the kind of resume that made him untouchable in institutional hierarchies. He wore his credentials the way other men wore armor, and everyone at Seattle General had learned to step around him carefully. He didn't look up as Brooke finished her assessment and moved toward the door, but she felt his attention like a change in barometric pressure. The ICU rounds began at 0645, and that's when everything shifted. Dr. Pierce entered the main station where the 12-bed ICU opened up like a semicircle around the central nurse's station, his white coat pristine, his movements economical. He was already holding her file, the personnel file, not the patient chart, and his expression had settled into something that looked almost like satisfaction. The other nurses were present. The residents were present. A visiting infectious disease consultant stood with his arms crossed, waiting for the daily briefing. "Let's talk about bed 12, Dr. Pierce said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Captain Riker. Excellent progress. Vital stable, neuro checks improving. But I want to make a staffing adjustment." He turned slightly, just enough for his eyes to find her across the station. "Our little nursing school dropout has been providing very enthusiastic care, but I think we need to redistribute the workload. Sullivan, you're reassigned effective immediately. Bed 8. That will be your assignment going forward." The room didn't gasp. That would have been too obvious. Instead, the room did something worse. It went perfectly, utterly silent. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The heart monitors beat their steady rhythm. The ventilators wheezed. But no one spoke. No one moved. This was how institutions worked, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, systematic removal of resources, the careful reorganization of power until someone who had been essential became suddenly expendable. Brooke stood at the far end of the station, a chart in her hands, her body perfectly still. Her jaw clenched once, very slightly, the kind of micro-expression that lasted maybe half a second before she reset her face into something neutral. She'd been trained to absorb shocks without showing them. She'd been trained in a military culture where orders were followed and complaints were filed separately, in private, if at all. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She simply closed the chart, set it on the desk, and nodded, a small, economical gesture that acknowledged the command without agreeing or disagreeing with it. "Understood, Doctor," she said quietly, keeping her voice level, keeping the accent out of her vowels. "Just a nurse. Just a competent medical technician accepting a reassignment." The mask she wore in this place slipped firmly into place, deferential, unremarkable, invisible. Dr. Pierce smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who had just won a battle that no one else had realized was being fought. He moved past her toward bed 12, toward Captain Riker, toward the patient she'd been managing since his arrival 3 months ago, and the victory in his posture was audible. "Let's examine the wound site," he said to the residents, establishing himself as the primary care provider, the one with the authority, the one whose judgment would shape this patient's recovery. Brooke moved toward bed 8, where a 63-year-old man with a post-operative bowel obstruction lay sleeping, his belly soft and distended beneath the cotton blanket. She had never assessed this patient before. She had never placed his lines, never documented his hours of recovery, never learned the specific way his blood pressure spiked when he was uncomfortable or the subtle signs that preceded his anxiety spirals. She was being moved away from the patient she understood completely, the patient she could predict, the patient who had her name tattooed on his arm even though he couldn't remember why. This was how the game was played in institutional medicine, not through direct confrontation, but through the subtle removal of ground beneath someone's feet until they either adapted or drowned. The break room was empty at 0730, which was unusual. Normally, the morning shift would be grabbing coffee, stealing 30 seconds of peace before the second wave of admissions arrived. But Brooke opened the door to find the space abandoned, the coffee maker still warm, someone's half-eaten granola bar sitting on the counter next to a notebook. She poured herself black coffee, no cream, no sugar, just the heat and the bitter, and sat at the small table by the window that looked out over the parking lot of Seattle General Hospital, Colorado Springs, the city sprawling beyond in grid patterns and suburban ordinariness. The room stayed empty. At 0740, she watched 2 nurses pass by the open doorway and veer away, suddenly remembering something urgent on another floor. At 0750, a resident started to enter, saw her sitting alone, and reversed course with barely concealed momentum. This was what Pierce had orchestrated, not just a reassignment, but a contagion effect. If you associated with Brooke Sullivan, if you sat near her, if you ate with her, you became vulnerable to his attention. You became guilty by association. So everyone made the small calculations that kept them safe, and one by one, the break room became a place she occupied alone. She didn't cry. That part was important. That part was the line between who she had been and who she was now. Her hands held the coffee cup steady. Her breathing remained even. There was a wall inside her, something built in a desert and maintained through 3 tours and 100 moments of controlled disaster, and right now she pressed against it and held. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the difference between an acceptable response and a disqualifying one. At 0805, she stood and moved toward the supply closet, the narrow room off the main hallway where 4 supplies and wound dressings were organized in careful rows. She closed the door behind her, the fluorescent light flickering to life, and pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving that held boxes of gauze and for tubing and 100 supplies used to keep people alive. 1 breath. 2 breaths. On the 3rd breath, she allowed her shoulders to drop just slightly, and her eyes closed, not tears, just the acknowledgement of pressure and the mechanics of release. 3 steadying breaths. That was what she allowed herself, what she had learned to give herself in the dark moments, 3 breaths where the mask could slip, where the composure could fracture just barely, where the weight of invisible things could press down without the world seeing how much it cost to carry them. Then the door opened, and a resident needed a 14-gauge angiocath needle for a line placement, and Brooke Sullivan's face reset like a camera focus, and she pointed him toward the second shelf without a tremor in her voice, and the war of attrition continued its patient, grinding progression. The resident froze, phone halfway to his ear, and Brooke moved past the chaos like water finding its downward path. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the ICU like a scalpel, announcing to every nurse within earshot, "Our little nursing school dropout has been reassigned, again. Sullivan, you're off Captain Riker's case effective immediately." His tone carried the weight of institutional authority, the casual cruelty of a man who'd weaponized his Harvard credentials into something sharp and cutting. Brooke kept her eyes on the patient chart in her hands. Her jaw clenched once, briefly, a single muscle movement that lasted less than a second, and then her face reset. She turned back to Captain Riker's bedside without a word, her hand steady on the fall line, adjusting the flow rate with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled ICU. Around her, the nurses' station fell into that particular silence that happens when someone is being dismantled in public. Pierce stepped closer, his presence a shifting pressure in the room. "I know bedpans are your speed, but try to keep up with the reassignment board, 2 residents laughed, nervous, uncertain laughs that sounded more like reflex than genuine amusement. Brooke continued documenting vitals without pause, her pen moving in smooth, practiced strokes. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat and professional. "Understood, doctor." That was all. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Not pleading. Just a simple acknowledgement of an order, delivered with the calm of someone reciting a patient's medication list. It seemed to infuriate him more than if she'd fought back. Pierce walked to the unit board with the deliberate pace of a man performing for an audience. He uncapped a red marker, the color reserved for warnings, for failures, for things that needed to be documented as institutional problems, and wrote in large block letters, "Sullivan, insubordination, failure to follow chain of command." The marker squeaked against the whiteboard. Several of the nurses pretended not to notice. Captain Riker's sister stood 3 feet away, her nephew pressed against her side, both of them watching the public disassembly with the helpless expressions of people witnessing something they couldn't stop. Brooke finished adjusting the fall line and moved on to the next patient without looking at the board. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained steady. The composure held like reinforced concrete, like something that had been poured years ago and had weathered far worse than this. Later, when she entered the break room at lunch with her tray, a sandwich she had no intention of finishing, a bottle of water, an apple she'd picked up from the cafeteria line, the exodus happened in real time. Janet grabbed her half-eaten lunch and muttered something about needing to check on a patient. Marcus avoided eye contact entirely, standing with his back to her as he rinsed his coffee cup. 3 other nurses she didn't know well enough to name made urgent excuses and moved toward the door. Within 30 seconds, the room had emptied around her like water draining from a sink. The contamination zone that Pierce had created extended even here, into this small room that smelled of burnt coffee and the faint chemical tang of the hospital's industrial cleaning solution. Brooke sat alone at the rectangular table, in a chair that still held the warmth of whoever had just abandoned it. She took one bite of her sandwich. Chewed mechanically. Tasted nothing. This was the strategy, not dramatic, not flashy, but systematic. Isolation. The slow removal of oxygen from her professional life. She'd seen it happen in military contexts before, the deliberate ostracization of someone who threatened the social hierarchy. It followed the same pattern, first the verbal strikes, then the official documentation, then the social separation, then the logistical restrictions that made it impossible to do the job well. She was, in many ways, watching the playbook unfold in real time. Watching someone competent execute a strategy against her. That was what made Dr. Pierce different from simple bullies. He wasn't just angry and loud. He was methodical. That evening, at 1847 hours exactly, she was restocking the crash carts on the 3rd floor, her newly assigned duty, designed to keep her away from the ICU, away from Captain Riker, away from any opportunity to demonstrate the competence that Pierce found so threatening. The crash cart gurney moved smoothly on its wheels as she positioned it, her fingers checking the inventory list with the automatic precision of muscle memory. Amiodarone. Sodium bicarbonate. 14-gauge angiocath needles in their sterile packaging. Intubation supplies arranged in descending order by size. Each item its own small prayer for a patient someone might need to save. The storage closet off the main hallway was dim and cool, the lighting flickering in that way that suggested the ballast needed replacing. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving unit after the final inventory count, the afternoon's accumulated weight settling across her shoulders like a physical thing. Her fingers gripped the edge of the shelf until her knuckles paled, until the pressure of her own hands became an anchor point against something that wanted to pull her under. 3 breaths. In. Hold. Out. The same technique she'd learned during advanced survival training, the same grounding method that soldiers used when the world was collapsing around them and the only thing between you and panic was the ability to control your own breathing. 3 breaths where the mask didn't have to hold. Where the posture didn't have to be perfect. Where the careful, measured composure could fracture just barely, just enough to let the pressure release before she straightened, unclenched her fingers from the shelf, and returned to the work that needed doing. Meanwhile, Pierce was making his first call. She didn't know this yet, wouldn't know it until later when the consequences materialized in the form of restricted access and reassigned staff, but at 19:30 hours he sat in his on-call room with his personal phone pressed to his ear, speaking to the nursing director in the soft, concerned tone of a colleague raising a legitimate patient safety issue. "I'm concerned about patient safety with Sullivan's current limitations," he said, letting the word limitations hang in the air like something contaminated. "Her lack of formal credentials has become increasingly problematic. I wonder if we should consider reassigning her to less critical areas, at least until we review her file more thoroughly." The nursing director, who had no context for the targeted campaign unfolding around her, made a note to follow up. By the following morning, Pierce had made a second call, this one to risk management, framing the same concerns in language that sounded objective, clinical, protective. By the end of the week, he had further restricted her ICU access, reassigned her trained support staff to other floors, altered the schedule so her shifts no longer overlapped with Captain Riker's care assignments. Each move calculated. Each move documented. Each move building a paper trail that would, from the outside, look like reasonable institutional oversight rather than what it actually was, a methodical dismantling. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0300 when the monitors in bed 12 began their urgent, escalating scream. Brooke was 2 corridors away, in the utility room, mechanically restocking crash carts, the task Pierce had assigned her, when the alarm pattern registered through the background noise of the hospital. She knew that sound like she knew her own heartbeat. The rhythm of escalating distress. Respiratory failure. The kind of emergency that didn't wait for convenient timing or official permissions. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She was already moving through the hallway, already moving toward the ICU, muscle memory taking the helm because muscle memory didn't require hesitation or authorization. It just acted. It responded. It knew what needed doing. The scene in bed 12 was textbook tension pneumothorax. Captain Riker's chest wall was moving asymmetrically, the right side barely moving at all, his trachea deviating left, his jugular veins distending like something was pressing from the inside out. The monitor showed oxygen saturation dropping with mechanical precision, 91%, 89, 86. His breathing had become shallow, desperate, the sound of someone drowning while sitting upright in a hospital bed. The night resident was frozen at the bedside, phone in hand, fumbling for the page button while the patient deteriorated in real time. Brooke was already pulling gloves from the wall dispenser, her movements economical, her mind narrowing down to the single focus that combat training had taught her, the patient, the procedure, the narrow window before irreversible damage occurred. The needle decompression kit came off the crash cart. Her hands found the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, muscle memory from a field hospital in Helmand Province where the patients were bleeding out under mortar fire, and you learned to do this fast or not at all. Dr. Pierce appeared from the on-call room, hair disheveled, his eyes going wide when he realized what was happening. "Sullivan, step away from that patient immediately." His voice cracked with panic and rage. He lunged for the wall phone. "Security! I need security to ICU bed 12 now." But Brooke's world had collapsed down to the size of a needle and a chest cavity and a man whose life was running out in measured decrements on a monitor. She prepped the site. Identified the exact anatomical landmark. And as Pierce's voice became something distant and irrelevant, she inserted the needle with perfect precision. The hiss of escaping air. The immediate, miraculous equalization of pressure. Captain Riker's chest wall symmetry returning. His oxygen saturation climbing, 88, 91, 94, the downward trajectory stopping, reversing, the patient stabilizing as the air that had been crushing his lungs escaped back into the atmosphere where it belonged. The code team crashed through the doors 30 seconds later, finding not chaos but a patient who was breathing, who was stable, who was alive because someone had violated the chain of command and refused to let institutional hierarchy matter more than a human pulse. Brooke stepped back from the bedside. She peeled off her gloves. She waited for what would come next, knowing already that this act of defiance would cost her, not understanding yet how much. The alarm pattern cut through the 0300 silence like a blade. 3 short bursts, then the continuous wail of a ventilator in distress, the exact acoustic signature of respiratory decompensation that Brooke's body recognized before her conscious mind could name it. Tension pneumothorax. The captain's lungs collapsing, his chest cavity filling with air that had nowhere to escape. She was 2 corridors away, restocking the crash cart on 3 North, her hands moving through the mechanical ritual of inventory, ambu bag, laryngeal blade, endotracheal tubes arranged by size. The alarm registered in her nervous system like a compass needle swinging toward true north. Her fingers stilled over the medication drawer. Not her assignment. Not her patient. Not anymore. But the sound pattern didn't care about reassignments. Brooke moved. No hesitation, no internal debate, muscle memory from 17 years of combat medicine taking command of her body. The crash cart wheel squeaked beneath her hands as she pushed it toward the stairwell, her scrub-covered legs covering the distance in a controlled run that looked deceptive to anyone watching, calm, measured, unremarkable. A nurse responding to a code. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would later matter. Nothing except that she was the only person in Seattle General who could hear what bed 12 was actually screaming. The ICU doors hissed open. Monitors surrounded the captain's bed like a constellation of red numbers and climbing waveforms. His chest was rising and falling with the mechanical desperation of a man drowning in air, his own lungs compressed against his spine while pneumothorax air expanded in the pleural space, collapsing his right side with the slow, inexorable pressure of a closing fist. His oxygen saturation flickering, 89, 86, 82. The monitor tracing his heart rate climbing, tachycardia compensating for a body in shock. Nobody moved yet. Nobody except the night nurse checking the monitor display, her eyes wide with the particular paralysis that comes when the numbers don't match the textbook. The ventilator was delivering air that had nowhere to go. The captain's chest was failing to expand. The physics of it all adding up to one simple, lethal equation. Brooke was moving before the code bell activated. "Needle decompression," she said. Not a request. The voice came out different than it had 3 days ago, not the deferential careful tone she'd cultivated for Pierce's benefit, but the command cadence of someone who had already decided. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. "I need the angiocath." The night nurse turned, her mouth opening to say something about scope and reassignment and protocol, but Brooke was already positioning the captain's right arm, her fingers finding the landmarks of his skeleton with the precision that only repetition builds. The second rib. The space beneath it. The thin membrane between life and suffocation. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. "You need to step back from this patient." Dr. Pierce materialized in the doorway like a summoned spectre, his white coat pristine despite the hour, his voice carrying the particular venom of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His eyes moved from Brooke to the captain to the monitor showing a descending oxygen saturation, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his features. "This is outside your scope of practice," he continued, his hand already moving toward his phone. "Security can be here in 45 seconds. The angiocath was in Brooke's hand. 14 gauge. The right size for rapid decompression. She didn't look at Pierce. She had learned long ago that validation required witnesses, and this moment belonged only to the captain and his failing lungs. "Step back," she said to the night nurse, her voice like the calm that comes before avalanches. The needle entered the second intercostal space with the smooth resistance of practiced entry. Through the skin. Through the fascia. Into the pleural space where 30 milliliters of air was suffocating the captain's right lung like a slowly tightening garrote. The hiss escaped. That sound, the release of trapped air escaping through a thin needle catheter, is the acoustic signature of salvation. A rush of pressure equalizing. The pneumothorax decompressing. The captain's chest suddenly able to expand again. His oxygen saturation began its climb. 85, 88, 91, climbing toward normal ranges like a child's first breath after drowning. "I said step back," Pierce repeated, his voice rising now, his composure beginning to fracture. "This patient is under my care, and you are violating every 72 hours, Brooke interrupted, still positioning the angiocath catheter, securing it with tape. The words came out calm and flat. "That's how long he had before this happened. That's how long your protocol would have kept this patient on a vent with expanding pneumothorax. He would have coded before the radiologist could confirm a diagnosis." The code team was arriving now, the actual attending physicians, the respiratory specialists, the crisis response infrastructure that was supposed to handle this moment. They moved past Pierce like water around a stone, their eyes immediately reading the monitors, the angiocath in place, the captain's oxygen saturation now stable at 94%. "What happened?" the attending asked, her gaze moving from the monitors to Brooke's hands to the secured needle. "Tension pneumothorax," Brooke said, her voice still that flat command tone. "Right pleural space. Decompression at 0304. Saturation recovered from 78% to 94 in 2 minutes. The attending looked at the numbers on the monitor. Looked at the stable tracings. Looked at the captain's chest finally moving with mechanical cooperation instead of desperate suffocation. "This is what prevented cardiac arrest," she said quietly. Not a question. A statement of fact. She turned to Pierce, who was standing frozen near the doorway, his phone still in his hand. "Who performed the decompression?" "That would be outside the scope of," Pierce began. "I did," Brooke said. She stepped back from the bed, her hands finally still, the immediate crisis resolved into something that the standard ICU team could manage now. The chest tube would need to be placed, The imaging would need to confirm the diagnosis. The protocols would need to be followed. But the captain would live because his lungs could expand now, because his heart could pump blood through tissue that wasn't suffocating, because someone had ignored the rules and saved his life anyway. The attending looked at her with something that might have been recognition. You? Brooke Sullivan. ICU nursing. She didn't add that she was supposed to have been reassigned. Didn't mention the written documentation that would appear in her personnel file accusing her of insubordination. Didn't say anything about the fact that this single act of defiance would become the justification for everything Pierce was about to unleash. That was textbook emergency decompression, the attending said. Not a reprimand. A clinical assessment delivered with the weight of professional acknowledgement. You probably just prevented sudden cardiac collapse. Pierce's jaw tightened. His phone moved to his ear as he stepped into the hallway, his voice already beginning its work of narrative construction, already framing this act of competence as recklessness, this moment of salvation as violation. Brooke had saved the captain's life. And in doing so, she had just given Dr. Pierce the justification he needed to destroy hers. The night nurse was staring at her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and pity. The attending was already ordering a chest tube, her clinical team moving with the efficiency of a group that understood the severity of what had almost happened. And Brooke was already understanding what tomorrow would bring. The incident report that Pierce was mentally drafting at this very moment. The calls to board members who golfed with him at the Colorado Springs Country Club. The careful narrative that would transform an act of life-saving into an act of dangerous scope violation. The paper trail that would lead, inevitably, to HR. She had one more shift. Maybe less. She had perhaps 12 hours before the institutional machinery that Dr. Pierce controlled began its work of extracting her from this place, from this patient, from the 3-year mission that had brought her to this ICU in the first place. But the captain would live. That was the equation that mattered now, everything else was mathematics of consequence and cost. She moved back toward the supply cart, her movements automatic, already beginning the process of stepping away from the bedside before Pierce could return with security at his heel. The monitors behind her showed normal sinus rhythm at 82 beats per minute. The captain's oxygen saturation stable at 95. One shift left. Maybe less. And then everything would change. The morning after the code blue, Dr. Pierce arrived at Seattle General at 06:05, before the shift change, before the hallways filled with residents and interns. He carried a leather portfolio, the kind that meant paperwork, the kind that meant consequence. Brooke was already there, finishing her charting from the overnight, her hands steady as they always were, moving through the digital records with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was a weapon just as lethal as any scalpel. Pierce had spent the night making calls. 4 of them. Strategic. Methodical. The first call went to Linda Chen, the director of nursing at 2,247 hours, just late enough to seem urgent, just early enough that she'd still be awake, still processing the overnight incident reports. Pierce's voice had been measured, almost disappointed. Linda, I need to document a serious scope of practice violation. Our nursing staff member initiated emergency procedures without physician authorization. I was explicitly ordering the code team to move her from the room when she performed the needle decompression. She's practicing medicine without a license. The second call went to risk management at 0312 hours, during the deepest part of the night when decisions feel heavier. This is Dr. Pierce. We have a liability exposure. A non-credentialed staff member performed an invasive procedure that resulted in positive patient outcome. Positive outcomes don't excuse protocol violations. In fact, they make us more vulnerable. If something had gone wrong, we'd face a malpractice claim and a disciplinary action from the state board. We need a paper trail documenting that I attempted to stop this breach. The third call was to board member Richard Stratton at 0428 hours, a man who golfed with Pierce on alternating Saturdays, who owed Pierce a favor from the credentialing committee vote 3 years ago. Richard, I hate making these calls, but I'm concerned about institutional liability. One of our nursing staff overstepped their license scope during last night's emergency. I documented it, reported it, but I wanted you to be aware before the director brings it to administration. It's the kind of thing that could expose us to regulatory scrutiny. The fourth call went to Dr. James Hartford, Chief Medical Officer, at 0531 hours, framed as a concerned colleague. James, I performed my duty last night. I documented a scope violation and reported it through proper channels. But I wanted to give you a heads up so you weren't blindsided. This is about patient safety and institutional integrity. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just doing my job. By 0700 hours, when Brooke finished her charting and turned to begin her shift, the machinery was already in motion. The gears had been moving all night, grinding away in the dark, invisible to her, systematic as a military operation, which was, Pierce understood on some level, exactly what she appreciated about him, even if she'd never admit it. They both understood how to use institutions as weapons. The termination paperwork was waiting for her at 0847 hours, handed to her by Linda Chen personally, in the HR office, with 2 witnesses present and the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly pallor. Brooke read the document silently, her eyes moving across the legal language with perfect composure, her breathing unchanged. Effective immediately, Linda said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd made the call because a superior officer had made the call to her. For practicing outside your license scope. Dr. Pierce documented that he explicitly ordered you to step back from the code blue, and you proceeded without physician authorization to perform a needle decompression procedure. Brooke's jaw tightened once. Just once. A barely perceptible moment where the muscle beneath her skin tensed and held, then released. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She didn't explain that the needle decompression had saved the captain's life, that the alternative was watching him die while protocol dictated that she stand motionless. She simply said, I understand. Her badge was surrendered at the security desk at 0903 hours. The young guard, a kid named Marcus who'd always waved her through with a nod, wouldn't quite meet her eyes as he ran the card through the deactivation scanner. The light blinked red. Access denied. The small plastic rectangle that had been her daily credential, her daily legitimacy, the daily proof that she belonged in this building, was slid across the desk and into a manila envelope. The security office smelled like stale coffee and the artificial lemon scent of industrial cleaner. Outside, the morning had turned grey, autumn rain beginning to tap against the reinforced glass, light and tentative at first, then heavier. Thunder rolled across the Colorado sky like something distant and inevitable. Her scrubs were in a locker on the 3rd floor, where the staff changed before their shifts. Brooke climbed the stairwell instead of taking the elevator, fewer people, quieter, the kind of path that someone who was leaving took. Her hands moved through the combination lock methodically. The navy blue fabric was still damp at the collar from the overnight shift, from the sweat and adrenaline of keeping a man alive while a superior officer screamed for her removal. She folded the scrubs carefully. The embroidered logo, Seattle General stitched in white thread, faced outward. 36 months. 1,090 days of this identity, this cover, this civilian camouflage that had fit like a second skin. The fabric was soft from countless washings, worn at the cuffs where the elastic had loosened, frayed at the hem from being caught in the stretcher wheels too many times. She folded them one final time and placed them on the shelf of the locker, the door closing with a soft click. Her final paycheck was waiting in the HR office on the ground floor. Direct deposit had been her standard arrangement, one less thing to pick up, one less reason to return to this building. But separation paperwork required a hand-signed acknowledgement, required her to walk into the office where Linda Chen was sitting with an expression that suggested she'd been ordered to deliver this particular termination and didn't much like the experience. The check was for 2 weeks severance plus unused vacation time, a total of $8,432, calculated down to the penny, printed on a piece of paper that smelled faintly of toner and institutional process. The accumulation of 36 months of service rendered invisible in a single document. Brooke, Linda said quietly, glancing toward the open door, ensuring they were essentially alone. What happened last night, what you did, it saved that man's life. Everyone saw it. Everyone knows it. Brooke accepted the check without looking at it. Her voice, when she spoke, was level as a horizon. The patient is alive. That's what matters. Yes, but Linda stopped, understanding that there were no words that would fix this, no administrative procedure that would undo what Pierce had engineered. If you need anything, if there's any way to fight this. There isn't, Brooke said, and it wasn't bitter, wasn't defeated. It was simply accurate. Pierce had been methodical. Pierce had documented everything. Pierce had moved through the institutional machinery like someone who understood exactly which levers to pull, which people owed him favors, which decisions would be made silently, in offices, away from the brightness of emergency medicine. He destroyed her cover not through direct action but through the careful manipulation of systems designed to protect institutions from liability. The irony, she understood completely, was that his caution, his obsessive documentation of her supposed protocol violation, meant there was now an official paper trail proving that she'd performed a procedure that saved a life. That documentation, the thing he'd created to destroy her, would eventually become the thing that proved exactly who she was. But he didn't know that yet. She collected her belongings from the staff locker, nothing substantial, just a phone charger and a paperback novel she'd been reading between shifts, and walked out of Seattle General at 09 for 6 hours. The rain had begun in earnest now, hammering the parking lot, the asphalt still warm enough to send up the distinctive smell of wet concrete and ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Her classified assignment to monitor Captain James Riker for recovered intelligence fragments, 3 years of careful observation, 3 years of documented medical assessments filed to a secure Pentagon server, 3 years of watching a man with her name tattooed on his arm and no memory of the woman who'd earned it, was now compromised. Burned. Over. Pierce's strategy had succeeded perfectly. By refusing to let a patient die on a technicality, Brooke had given him exactly what he needed to destroy her cover. She'd stepped outside protocol and in doing so had stepped outside the protection that protocol provided. The rain tasted like rust and electricity as she walked toward her car, alone in the parking lot except for the distant sound of a helicopter, rotor wash somewhere on the hospital's rooftop pad, the mechanical thunder of something arriving. But that sound would be the last thing she heard as a nurse at Seattle General. What happened next would rewrite everything. The rotor wash hit the hospital windows like a physical force, rattling panes in their frames, shaking loose ceiling tiles in the hallway outside the ICU. The Black Hawk descended toward Seattle General's rooftop pad, its rotors hammering the air into submission, and Brooke felt the pressure change in her ears as the aircraft touched down. She'd heard that sound 1,000 times before, in deserts, in mountains, in the seconds before extraction. But never while wearing a visitor's badge and holding a manila envelope containing her final paycheck. The medevac was priority. Everyone moved. Trauma surgeons emerged from the stairwell, nurses mobilized toward the elevators, the entire hospital machinery shifting into overdrive as a Taliban commander was wheeled through emergency intake, his body wrapped in field dressing, his eyes wild and searching. Brooke stood in the third-floor hallway near the administrative office where she'd collected her termination paperwork 43 minutes earlier. She wasn't supposed to be here anymore. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere in this hospital. Her credentials were revoked, her access terminated, her mission over, burned completely. The elevator doors opened. The trauma team rushed past her without acknowledgement. She was already invisible. But that invisibility lasted exactly until the moment the Taliban commander's eyes focused past the stretcher, past the surgeons and nurses, and locked directly onto her face. His body went rigid. His mouth opened. And then he screamed, a sound that cut through the hospital chaos like a blade, raw and unmistakable, Duktari Atash. Duktari Atash. Daughter of fire. Daughter of fire. The hallway went absolutely still. The stretcher stopped moving. The surgeons froze. Every person within 20 feet turned toward the source of that scream, and then toward Brooke, standing alone in her civilian jacket, holding a manila envelope, her face showing absolutely nothing, a mask so perfectly composed that the commander's recognition somehow made her seem even more terrifying, not less. "Keep moving," she said. "Quiet. Flat. This patient requires surgery." But the surgeons didn't move. They were staring at her, at the commander, at the suddenly electric space between them. The commander was still screaming, still recognizing, his voice raw with something that sounded like fear or reverence or possibly both. One of the nurses looked at another nurse. That nurse pulled out her phone. Captain Morrison, the Marine liaison officer who'd been standing near the trauma intake desk, walked toward Brooke holding his tablet. He moved like someone who'd just been given coordinates to something important. He didn't ask permission. He simply spoke, reading from the screen in a voice loud enough to carry down the entire hallway. Captain Brooke Sullivan received the Navy Cross for single-handedly extracting 6 wounded sailors through active fire in Helmand Province. Citation reads, without regard for her own safety, under sustained enemy fire, Captain Sullivan maintained position and provided suppressive fire while evacuating wounded personnel across a 300-meter minefield. Her actions resulted in the recovery of 6 Navy SEAL Team 3 personnel and the elimination of 4 hostile combatants. The commander's screaming became laughter. Broken, reverent laughter. 2 nurses were filming now. The hallway had become a silent, crystalline moment, the kind that doesn't feel real until it's already spreading through the building like electricity. Morrison continued reading, Bronze Star. He paused. Looked up at Brooke. Silver Star. Another pause. 2 purple hearts. The tablet glowed in his hands. And the Navy Cross. A 2-star general in dress uniform emerged from the stairwell. Apparently he'd been waiting somewhere. Apparently this had been coordinated. Apparently the Pentagon had known exactly when and where she would be. He removed his dress cap with the precision of someone who'd saluted flags 1,000 times. He looked at Brooke's civilian jacket, at the worn collar, at the faded seam where she'd sewn a unit patch from Naval Special Warfare Group 1, the patch she'd stitched in at 3 in the morning 17 months ago, hand steady as surgical lasers, knowing that someday someone would need to see it. The general saw it. He saw the combat decoration sewn inside the lining. He nodded once, a gesture that meant everything. And then Dr. Pierce pushed through the gathering crowd. This is stolen valor, he shouted, his voice climbing toward something that wasn't quite panic, wasn't quite rage. This is fraud. This is a fraud against this institution and against, his words were running together now, his composure cracking in real time, his Harvard ring glinting as he pointed at Brooke. She's not even a licensed nurse. She has no credentials. I don't know what kind of con this is, but I will. A voice cut him off. Not loud. Just present. Captain Sullivan, call sign Lioness 6. I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Pentagon Liaison. I've been authorized to inform Dr. Pierce that Captain Sullivan's medical monitoring assignment in this hospital was classified counterintelligence operation under JSOC Task Force coordination. The liaison stepped from the stairwell with the unhurried gait of someone who'd just ended a career. The captain was embedded here to assess Captain James Riker's recovery trajectory and determine if he retained classified information from his capture in Helmand Province. You were not briefed on this operation because you did not have clearance for it. Your interference with her assignment constitutes obstruction of a classified Pentagon operation. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water, drowning in Colorado air. You destroyed the mission, Hayes continued, her voice clinical, precise. You terminated a decorated Navy SEAL without understanding who she was or what she was doing here. You put 6 years of counterintelligence work at risk because you couldn't tolerate someone you perceived as beneath you. A nurse's phone was recording. Then another. Then 3 more. The hallway had become a perfect storm of documentation. Brooke watched with the detached clarity that came from having seen worse things than a Harvard pedigree crumbling in real time. She watched Dr. Pierce's face go white, then red, then gray, a color progression that looked like a blood pressure dropping in real time. The video would reach Dr. Ashford within 20 minutes. The chief of surgery would be reading it in his office, watching the moment his former protégé discovered he'd been trying to destroy a decorated military officer conducting classified service. Ashford's response would be an email that copied the entire hospital board, the state licensing authority, and every administrator in the system. Ashford's response would include the phrase appalled and deeply ashamed and formally and publicly withdraw any professional association. Ashford's response would end Dr. Marcus Pierce's career before sunset. But Brooke didn't need to watch that unfold. She already knew how it would end. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the rough threads of the unit patch, the fabric that had survived 3 years of undercover work and 1 spectacular public destruction. Her fingers traced the stitching, 17 hours of work done in darkness, the needle moving with muscle memory that never forgot, even when her cover was burning. The general was still standing with his cap removed. Captain Morrison was still holding his tablet. The Taliban commander was still screaming Duktariatash with something that sounded like gratitude or maybe recognition of kinship, the sound of one person who'd survived impossible odds acknowledging another. And Dr. Pierce was still standing in the hallway, his mouth moving soundlessly, his entire world collapsing in the time it took a handful of nurses to press record on their phones. Brooke allowed herself a smile. Barely visible. Just enough. The kind of smile that said everything about composure under pressure, about the difference between credentials and competence, about what happened when you underestimated someone who'd already survived worse than your contempt. She turned toward the stairwell. Toward the stairs. Toward whatever came next. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together, the general said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Brooke didn't respond. She didn't need to. The sound of her boots on the tile, steady, measured, professional, was answer enough. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority, if you've ever had to prove your value when credentials meant nothing and competence meant everything, subscribe and let me know in the comments. Like this video if you believe power is about what you can do, not what title you wear. And tell me, would you have stayed silent like Brooke, or would you have demanded recognition from day one?